Hello, this is Professor Milsom. I want to give you an introduction to Toni Morrison's Beloved, our final book of the semester. Before you get started reading it, I highly recommend you read the foreword, and I'm urging you all to look through all the materials I've posted on Blackboard. Without the context for this novel, it's extremely difficult to read. So I really want you to feel confident that you know what's going on even before you get into the book. Also, watching the film, which is from 1998, made by Oprah Winfrey, is an excellent place to start. Note of caution, however, this is a book in which we not only see all the Gothic elements we've already discussed, things such as sexual abuse, domineering, villainous men, vulnerable women, enclosed spaces. The fact that it's rooted in a true story from United States history makes it all the more horrific to encounter, even when we're encountering it through the work of perhaps the United States' greatest writer of all time, Toni Morrison. Even in her hands, nothing can really ease the blow of confronting this dark history. And the fact that the book is based on a true story, which Toni Morrison describes in the foreword to the book. So as we embark on this journey, which is filled with the supernatural, it's a ghost story after all. Beloved is the name of a ghost. I want to warn you that this is, in fact, the ghost of a dead baby, one killed at the hands of her own mother, who, while escaping enslavement in the American South pre-Civil War, decided that her baby would be better off dead than as a slave. And this is, in fact, a true story, which I'm going to discuss in the next few slides. But you need that warning because this is not just a fun ghost story. This is, in fact, a horrific one. True horror. Although the film and the book both have elements of humor in them to alleviate the stress. I can't say this enough. It's horrific. And that's what happens when the Gothic comes across the Atlantic Ocean and merges with the horrific history of genocide and enslavement that is United States history. Okay, so without further ado, here's a quotation from the foreword. And this is Toni Morrison talking here. So this is some insight into why she wrote that. She begins the foreword. In 1983, I lost my job, or left it, after a few days after my last day at work, which, by the way, she was an editor at a big publishing house. I was sitting in front of my house. I began to feel an edginess instead of the calm I had expected. I couldn't fathom what was so unexpectedly troubling on a day that perfect, watching a river that serene. Then it slapped me. I was happy, free in a way I had never been, ever. Enter Beloved. So she's describing what was going on. She had quit her job, basically, so that she could write novels full-time, and she was feeling free and happy. And that's when this ghost and this ghost story occurred to her. Okay, continuing. I think now it was the shock of liberation that drew my thoughts to what free could possibly mean to women. In the 1980s, the debate was still roiling. Equal pay, equal treatment, access to professions, schools, and choice, she means reproductive choice, without stigma. To marry or not, to have children or not. Okay, pause here. So she's talking about she's finally free. And she's like, well, what does that even mean to women? We still live in an era where freedom doesn't mean equality, right? And then she continues, inevitably, These thoughts led me to the different history of black women in this country. By the way, Toni Morrison was a black woman. She just died a few months ago, but she's pointing out that like white and black women don't have the same history, and this idea of freedom is different when you are a black woman in the United States. She writes, a history of black women in this country, a history in which marriage was discouraged, impossible, or illegal, in which birthing children was required, but having them, being responsible for them, being, in other words, their parent, was as out of the question as freedom. Assertions of parenthood under conditions peculiar to the logic of institutional enslavement were criminal, end quote. So what she's talking about here is that, 120 years, only a few generations before she was writing this book, in the early 80s, only a few generations before, so we're talking her grandparents' age, black Americans who were enslaved were not allowed to have families. And it was illegal to marry, it was illegal to keep your children, your children were property, and they were owned by the person who enslaved you. So this is occurring to her in this moment of great freedom. Okay, so this is her description. So as she's thinking about freedom, she thinks about Margaret Garner. Margaret Garner, and that's who this book is based on. This is the true figure from history. She writes, quote, this is page 17 of the Foreword, XVII, Roman numerals. She writes, quote, Margaret Garner was a young mother who, having escaped slavery, was arrested for killing one of her children and trying to kill the others rather than let them be returned to the owner's plantation. She became a cause célèbre, like a famous case, in the fight against the fugitive slave laws which mandated the return of escapees to their owners. Her sanity and lack of repentance caught the attention of the abolitionists as well as newspapers. She was certainly single-minded, and, judging by her comments, she had the intellect, the ferocity, and the willingness to risk everything for what, to her, was the necessity of freedom, unquote. I'll go back to this here. So she escaped slavery. She had 4 children. She became famous because... So there were, at the time, in around 1850, this law, the Fugitive Slave Act, was passed. This was a federal law in the United States. This is before the Civil War. So basically, if you crossed into the North, if you were a slave and you escaped, if you crossed into the North, you still weren't free, because if you were caught, you were a piece of property. You were not a human, according to this law, and as a piece of property, you would be returned to your owner. So that meant if you got caught escaping, even if you made it to Maine or New York or Ohio, Michigan, under federal law, you would be sent back. And so this was a new law. It was very controversial in the years leading to the Civil War, and she got caught, and she started killing her children because she didn't want them to be sent back. That's how bad it was. So, but she wasn't insane, and she wasn't sorry. So what does that tell us? It tells us how horrific, this is a symbol of how horrific enslavement was, right? So just some context here. This is the United States, right? Today, they didn't have all these states back in, all these states hadn't been formed back in the 1850s and 60s. So here's New York, that's where we are. Here's Ohio, and here's Kentucky. And she was on a plantation in Kentucky, and she fled with her 4 children and her husband, and they fled to just across the river. So you can see it's actually not that far. So down here, this is a blow up from Kentucky to Ohio. This is the route. You can say this is the Ohio River. You cross this river and you're free, supposedly. So they got to the house of her uncle, and then they got caught. So in 1856, this is what happened. Margaret Garner was found with her 4 kids in her uncle's house in Cincinnati by slave catchers and U.S. Marshals. One child's head was nearly cut off. The second child had its throat slashed but wasn't dead. The other two were injured, so she was knocking him out. Robert Garner and the father fought. They only had one gun. The two men were fighting the 11 armed men, and during the battle, Mrs. Garner used a butcher knife. Then her firstborn child was the only one that was fathered by her husband. The other three children were the product of rape. She was continuously raped by her enslaver. So this is just a fact of enslavement, just constant sexual abuse. So her husband, Robert, would be sent away. He would be rented out, his work, as a laborer to other plantations for a year at a time, and he'd come back and she'd be pregnant again. So keep in mind that, enslavement wasn't just work, it was also rape. It was also having your wife raped, having your children raped, constantly. So anyway, this led to what was the longest court hearing of the period. So they couldn't just take her back to the plantation when they caught her, because now she was being charged with murder. But this raised a big legal dilemma. She could be tried as a person in Ohio, because she was in Ohio. And if she were a person, she could be charged with murder and then pardoned if people felt pity. Or would she be tried as property according to the Fugitive Slave Act and sent back to enslavement? So you can't charge a piece of property with murder. And a slave was a very valuable piece of property, by the way. I mean, today's dollars, they say one human was perhaps anywhere from what today's dollars would be $30,000 to $70,000. So that's a very expensive piece of property. And not only that, they're self-reproducing, right? It'd be like if you have a car that you could have make other cars with, because, as I said, they were used for reproductive purposes. So, the judge had to decide, will we try her as a person or will we try her as property? So the judge ruled she was property under this Fugitive Slave Act, sent back to the plantation. When she was back at the plantation, she was sold to a farm in Mississippi, and en route, actually there was an accident. So she was on this steamship on the Mississippi River going down to Mississippi, deeper south, and some sort of accident. She fell off the boat, suspiciously, with two of her babies, and one of them, she didn't emerge with one of them, so she may have killed another of her children. But then, the date here is wrong, it is actually the next year, 1856, she died from typhoid. And when they decided to retry her for murder, she couldn't be found. Her husband and the other children survived, and her husband actually fought in the Civil War and was interviewed. So this is who the book Beloved is based on, this woman's story. And Morrison, acknowledges the horrific nature of this. She says she purposefully creates this sense of horror. She wants to, quote, invite the readers and myself into the repellent landscape, hidden but not completely, deliberately buried but not forgotten. And to do so was to pitch a tent in a cemetery inhabited by highly vocal ghosts. So as a novelist, she's not going to tell this story exactly, but she's going to create this world. And she calls it the repellent landscape. This is the repellent landscape of enslavement and its effects. And this is a bit of imagery here, a good metaphor we can look at later. To go into this repellent landscape, she says, she compares it to pitching a tent, setting up a tent in a cemetery inhabited by highly vocal ghosts. But she also, in these parentheses here, she's like, it's hidden, but not completely. It's deliberately buried, but not forgotten. And I really think about this phrase, deliberately buried, quite a bit, because this isn't the history that we love to tell in our history classes. We deliberately have buried this. If you think these days, there's this controversy in the South of these or actually even here in the North, people taking down these monuments of Civil War soldiers, they still celebrate these people who fought on the side of slavery. And it's part of this deliberately burying the repellent landscape. It's on purpose because the facts of this history are so brutal. They're so bad. And just to tie it to our study of the Gothic, there's so many things we've seen this semester that are truly repelling. Like, think of Manfred in Otranto, and think of how cruel people are in Frankenstein to the creature. And while those texts are somewhat entertaining, they're reflecting real horror in our daily lives, and I think this really captures that. So she also, I mentioned before, this is a very difficult book. It's hard. It's not only hard to watch because it's horrific, but it's also you'll see it's very difficult to read because there's so many flashbacks back and forth, and it feels very psychological. And she says in the foreword here, she creates this sense of disorientation in the novel, and it's also in the film, and this sense is on purpose. She writes, quote, "I wanted the reader to be kidnapped, thrown ruthlessly into an alien environment as the first step into a shared experience with the book's population. Just as the characters were snatched from one place to another, from any place to any other, without preparation or defense," unquote. So it's not often we get authors telling us why they write a certain way, but here we have it. She wants us to feel disoriented and kidnapped and confused. So if you're feeling that way while you read, remember, she's doing that on purpose. And that's because the characters were disoriented. And, one day you live and work one place, and then the next you could be just sent down the river and never get to say goodbye to your children or to your mother, and never see them again. So I wanted to give you all that. Now, before you start reading, a few things to keep in mind. This is my very rough drawing. It's from something I drew on the board in a class, but it helps give you some orientation before you get started, and this is up on Blackboard too. So there's sort of 3 major places in the book, and they also are different in terms of time. So, and I'll go into more history later, but the American Civil War was in the 1860s, so slavery was before the 1860s, and then, so in the book, on the left here you see, this is slavery, right? And this is Sweet Home Plantation in Kentucky. And there's the big house, there's Mr. and Mrs. Garner, so she keeps those names, Toni Morrison keeps those names. Those were the names of the plantation owners in real life. So the Garners. Now, Mr. Garner here dies, and Mrs. Garner marries a fellow named schoolteacher, or he comes on the property, and he has 2 sons, nephews. It's not really clear how they're related. He's quite cruel. His sons are crueler, and it's not a huge plantation. So over here, they had 6. Well, they had 7. One replaces the other, so there were always about 6 enslaved people with them. The main character is here, Setha. It's spelled Seth with an E. Setha is pronounced. And then there's Baby Suggs. So Baby Suggs is the mother of Hallie, and Hallie works on weekends for many years so he can buy Baby Suggs her freedom. But once she gets it, actually, the Civil War happens, and it's like, there's a line that's pretty devastating, like, it doesn't even matter anymore because she would have been free anyway. But her son, Hallie, and then there's Sixo, and then there's 3 Pauls, Paul A, Paul F, Paul D, and they all take the last name Garner. So Seth arrives to replace Baby Suggs, and she gets to choose between the men. They give her a year, they leave her alone, and she chooses Hallie. He's the nicest. And then they had 3 kids, Howard, Bugler, and then a baby whose name we don't learn until later is going to be Beloved. And then she gets pregnant with a 4th, and that's when they escape. So then we have this journey. So she sends the 3 kids ahead. There's a reason for that. You'll see later. But she's pregnant, and she's, running. She's like 6 months pregnant or so. And so she sets off. She escapes. She says, I took one journey and paid for the ticket. It cost too much. So as she's escaping, she's nearly dead. And this white girl, that's one word, named Amy Denver, actually. Amy Denver helps her deliver Denver on the journey. And then they get to freedom. And the book will be basically, most of which will take place 18 years later, but she arrives, gets to the house. It's 124. That's the first line of the book, the story. And 124 is the address. Toni Morrison talks about why that's important. It's a big deal that a person who used to be enslaved now owns a house, and it has 2 floors. It's Baby's house. She dies early on, though. But Seth arrives there with Denver, and her children are already there, and they have like a month or so of like happiness. And then the school teacher and a bunch of marshals show up to get her back. And I'm kind of ruining a little bit of the plot here, but otherwise it makes no sense. And she kills the baby, one of the babies. She has Denver, the 2 boys, and then the baby. She kills the baby as they arrive. She knocks out the other ones, and then she gets put in prison. So it's very horrible. And then the baby becomes a ghost that haunts the house. So the book opens describing the house as haunted, and it's years later. The 2 boys, Howard and Bugler, they run off because they're sick of living in a haunted house. Denver seems to like the haunted house. Baby Suggs eventually dies. So it's just Seth and Denver by the time the main action of the book takes place. Denver's a little bit older now. And then Paul D shows up. And I remember Paul D over here from the plantation. He's one of the Sweet Home men. Sweet Home's the plantation. And after 18 years, he finds his way to this house to learn that Baby is dead, but Seth and Denver sort of take him in, and Seth and Paul get together romantically. All right. And upon his arrival, you'll see in the very beginning that the ghost sort of attacks him and throws this table at him. And this house is in Ohio, by the way. And that's kind of the setup for the book. So there's a lot of flashbacks. Sometimes they're flashbacks to the journey. Sometimes they're flashbacks to the plantation. And then sometimes they're flashbacks later on in the book to Paul D's life. Because after he left the plantation, he was imprisoned, sent to a chain gang. And that's more scenes of torture and humiliation that really are horrible to read, but also remember it's all truth. This is all real stuff. And then, so Paul D's hanging around the house now. He and Seth are together, and he fights off the ghost. The house stops being haunted, but then you'll see, like, soon into the book, a strange woman appears, and she happens to be the age that the baby would have been. And it's a ghost story, so this is kind of the ghost of that dead baby come to life, and she comes to live with her mother and sister and Paul D. So that'll help orient you. And I know these details are hard to follow and take in. Now, before I conclude, I want to just show you on Blackboard. I put all these things up here. This is our Blackboard page, Unit 6, Beloved. So here's the characters and setting if you want to take a look at that. I'd love for any of you to do a nicer job drawing this. Some of you are very talented. I'll put your more beautiful ones here instead and use them in the future if you'll allow me I might try to make another one. This is where the lectures are. Here's the plot questions. Again, plot questions are not required, but they will guide you through the plot. So I urge you to print them out or keep them on the screen while you read. Now, here's some videos you should watch. This is a quick. It looks old. It's kind of old. It's a quick video, 12 minutes, about Margaret Garner, told by some historians. And this is where I got a lot of my information. This is another short video, only 5 minutes, about the Margaret Garner story. Again, watch it. Now, there's a lot of interviews and videos of Toni Morrison out there because she was so famous and only recently died. So you should watch this video. Here's another conversation with her. I've included this. This is Margaret Garner primary documents, which you can take a look at. These are from around the time it happened. There's a story. Some of the information in here is not totally accurate. As we know, when things come out, they're not always accurate. But here's a news story. So this is from the Anti-Slavery Bugle. That's an anti-slavery newspaper, so an abolitionist newspaper. And like I said before, she became famous. And Toni Morrison said a cause célèbre, like a celebrated cause, because she became a symbol of the horrors of enslavement. So you can take a look at this. Here's another story about Margaret Garner. Margaret Garner, again, is Seth in our story. And then back to this page. This is great. This is a New York Times article about Margaret Garner in a series they have called Overlooked: Remarkable Black Women and Men Who Never Received Obituaries in the New York Times Until Now. So here's an obituary from Margaret Garner. In one soul-chilling moment, she killed her own daughter rather than return her to the horrors of slavery. Her life inspired a Toni Morrison novel. And it's a very good article. And then this is where our essay will be, and discussion forum and journal check. Okay, so as always, please let me know if you have any questions, and good luck reading this. It takes time, but I recommend doing about 15 pages a day. Email me if you have any questions or post in the discussion board.